Hello, everyone, and good morning. Thank you for joining this morning's Dods webinar on special advisors, who they are, what they do, and how to engage with them. This is the inaugural event of our Insights webinar series. This is going to be brought to you by Dods Research. And as such, what you'll see in front of you on your screen is a little discount, 10% off a Dods Research product for all those who are in the audience today. If you are already a Dods client, you can always reach out to your account manager to quote this and get the ball rolling on a Dods Research product. And those of you who are watching and aren't actually already subscribers, please reach out to our customer services team and you can quote this offer. And also speak about any other services, including Dods Monitoring, Dods People, and Dods Research. So, as I said, this is our first in a series of webinars. And as usual, us at Dods, we want to make sure that we're bringing you the insights that you will find helpful in your day-to-day roles. So if there is anything that you would like us to cover in future sessions, please reach out and let us know. So for instance, there might be a session on the role of party conference in the shaping the policy process, how APPGs work, or in how to engage with private members' bills. And if you have any ideas for those, please use the comments section, which you'll find below, and drop us a comment and let us know what you'd like to see maybe in the future. Today, I am delighted to be able to be joined by Professor Patrick Diamond on this session on special advisors and how they shape policy. Patrick brings a fascinating mix of both academic experience and real-world experience in government. He's currently Professor of Public Policy at Queen Mary University of London, and he's held senior roles in government, including Head of Policy Planning at Number 10 during the 2000s. He's a regular voice in national and international media, from the Financial Times to Die Zeit, and has featured across BBC Radio 4, Newsnight, Sky News, and much more. We're incredibly lucky to have him with us here today to talk to us about the role of special advisors, what they do, why they matter, and how best to engage with them. Before I pass over to you, Patrick, to get us underway, I just want to let everyone in the audience know that there is a little Q&A box that you can click on, and you're able to pop in any questions, which I will then later on, towards the end of the session, pose to Patrick. So please feel free to drop them in at any time throughout. So Patrick, you're now at QMU, who I know are partnered with Dods Research to deliver our research product. I wanted to quickly explore with you your research interests and your experience there.
Yeah, well, good morning, Dean, and it's great to be with you. And I know everybody at Queen Mary is delighted to be involved in this partnership with Dods, giving us the opportunity to work across the different fields of expertise that we have. My interest in government stems from my time working as a special advisor in British government in the early 2000s through to 2010. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But since the early 2010s, I've focused much more on academic research. And my core interest is really, how do we make government work better? And that includes a variety of questions, from how do we make sure that the policy process is better focused on achieving the right outcomes, and also deals with the new kinds of policy problems we face in the world today, from climate change through to the challenges of new technology. But my work also addresses how do we implement policies better. One of the issues that governments have always struggled with is delivery. How do we turn plans into concrete actions which then achieve the right outcomes for citizens? And in my academic research, I try to focus not just on the problems of policy implementation, but also how do we make it better, and how do we help governments and other organizations to deliver, as I say, services that citizens really value.
Fab. Thank you very much, Patrick. And so you did mention there at the beginning your time as working within the government in the 2000s. I guess an initial question there is whether you can give us a quick overview of your experience there.
Sure. So I was a special advisor between 2000 and 2005, and then I did a second stint between 2009 and 2010. The departments I worked for were, I guess, what you think of as central departments. So I worked as a SPAD in Number 10 Downing Street for the Prime Minister, both for Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. I also did a short period in the Cabinet Office, which is the central department linked into Number 10, as well as a period working in the Northern Ireland Office, which is obviously a very different kind of department, which is which was at the time and still is engaged, obviously, in bringing peace and stability to Northern Ireland. So a variety of different experiences, but in all that time, I was a special advisor. I think it's worth saying that, of course, that was a very different time, although it feels like only yesterday. For me, it was, of course, going on for 15 years ago. And a lot of how government works and how special advisors work has changed in that period. I'm going to try and reflect on a bit of that in our session today.
Brilliant. So I guess that takes us on to our initial question to get the ball rolling. What is it that a special advisor does? What is a special advisor?
Yeah, so a special advisor is technically a temporary civil servant. So special advisors are actually part of the civil service. The civil service, obviously, being the permanent bureaucracy which supports the government of the day to carry through its policies and deliver them in the real world. What marks out a special advisor and makes them different to a civil servant, though, is that a special advisor is able to act politically, so they can bring a political dimension to what they do. They can advise on policy in a way that takes account of politics. And they can also handle issues, whether it's the media or members of parliament, in a much more political way than civil servants could do. It's also, of course, important to stress that special advisors are therefore temporary. So civil servants, normal civil servants, are appointed to their roles on permanent contracts. For a special advisor, they last as long in their role as their minister does. And once their minister leaves their role as a Secretary of State, the special advisor's appointment also ends. So, it's an existence which can be precarious, uncertain, and unstable. But that really is the essence of what a special advisor is. As I say, their role is to support ministers and to provide political advice. So a minister in a department will have a range of different priorities, the things that they want to achieve while they're there. And the special advisor's role is to support them to do that. And of course, they have potentially hundreds, if not thousands, of civil servants who would also support them. But what a special advisor can bring is that political perspective and that ability to handle issues in a political way. Just a couple of other points I would stress, Dean, on what a special advisor is. Special advisors are technically appointed by the Prime Minister, so every special advisor appointment has to be signed off by the Prime Minister in 10 Downing Street. In practice, special advisors are selected by the Secretary of State who oversees that department. So normally Secretaries of State will be able to appoint around 2 special advisors. Occasionally it's a few more than that, but usually 2 special advisors in their department. And it will be their decision, although officially signed off by the Prime Minister. It's actually very unusual that a Prime Minister would ever refuse a special advisor proposed appointment. It's happened in 1 or 2 instances, but it's very rare. The other thing which some people on the call may find slightly odd, if not unusual, is that special advisors are not subject to any formal recruitment process. So by and large, these jobs are not advertised. There's no formal recruitment practice. You don't have to do an interview or a selection or a test. Normally, this is done through personal contacts between the Secretary of State and the special advisor candidates. And then just finally to say that in terms of the distribution of special advisors across government, as I say, there are normally 2 special advisors per department, but there are also a large number of special advisors in number 10 Downing Street working closely with the Prime Minister, and also usually a large number of special advisors working in the Treasury to support the very important work that the Chancellor of the Exchequer is doing. So that in a few minutes is, in essence, Dean, what we would consider to be a special advisor.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, I think that gives us a very clear idea of what it actually is that a special advisor, who they are and what they actually do, I suppose. I guess what would be good to know from there is how widespread across government they are. Are they sort of in a handful of departments, or is it, we're talking about people who are working for every minister in every department?
So normally every Secretary of State would appoint, as I say, usually 2 special advisors. There have been 1 or 2 cases where a Secretary of State only wants 1 special advisor because for whatever reason they feel that that's all of the political support that they need in that particular role. But it's normally 2. There are a few cases where it goes a bit beyond that. For example, in the Home Office, there have historically been sometimes more than 2 special advisors because of the nature and challenges of that particular role. But it's normally 2 in each government department. And I just put on this slide a sense of the numbers just so that people can see how those change over time. So over the last 15 years, which is obviously beyond the time when I was a special advisor, when the Cameron government came to power in 2010, as you can see on the slide, the special advisor numbers actually fell quite significantly. So in the Labour governments, there had been over 100 special advisors, and that fell initially in the Cameron period to around 60. But again, as you can see on the slide, over the next 3 or 4 years, the number of special advisors then increases. By the end of 2014, you're back up to 100 special advisors. And then you can see over the next few years, the number of SPADs continues to increase to the point whereby during Boris Johnson's premiership, there were nearly 140 special advisors operating in Whitehall. The other thing, just to say quickly, Dean, is that obviously there's a lot of churn going on here. So
Mhm.
again, as the slide shows, there are special advisors moving in and out of government the whole time. Those periods of churn tend to coincide both with elections. So when you have a general election, subsequent to that election, even if the same party remains in power, there will obviously be quite often a ministerial reshuffle, which means that special advisors will also change. And of course, again, as people on this call very well know, the last few years have been characterized by quite a lot of churn in prime ministers. So we had a new prime minister after the Brexit referendum in 2016, then of course Boris Johnson in 2019, then Rishi Sunak in 2022, not forgetting of course Liz Truss for a few weeks between Johnson and Sunak. And with each prime minister, inevitably, of course, that means that there are new special advisor appointments as ministers change. And of course, when the Starmer government came to power in July 2024, just a year ago, there was similarly, of course, a huge churn in the special advisor appointments across Whitehall. So, as I say, the numbers change, although they're not dramatic changes. And there's quite a lot of flux and churn in special advisor appointments.
I think what you've said is quite evidenced in the numbers here. Year to year, there isn't a huge amount of change. What we can see is there is quite a significant growth from the beginning of this chart. So, what is it that they're all actually doing, and how are the roles, I guess, split across government?
So, in terms of the roles that special advisors fulfill, I think we could say that there are three core roles that special advisors perform in their jobs. So, the first is obviously a policy role where they're providing policy advice to ministers, but with a political dimension. And when I say a political dimension, that might mean a concern with electoral politics. If we do a certain policy, will that have an effect on our electoral support among key groups? It may also mean thinking about how different organisations might react to a policy. For example, what would the trade unions think if we introduced a certain reform in public services or whatever it might be? Now, of course, civil servants could also think in this way, but what's, I think, significant about a special advisor who's providing policy advice is that they're able to really highlight the political dimensions of any decision in a way a civil servant often would not feel comfortable doing. Then there's a second role, which is about communications. And I think this is the role that we often associate with special advisors in the UK. Again, many people on the call will have heard the phrase spin doctor, which is the phrase we use to describe somebody who is responsible for briefing the press and spinning stories and putting the best presentational case for the minister and the government that they can. But I think it is worth saying that, in fact, during most of the period I've described previously, and also under the new Labour governments, the majority of special advisors were actually performing a policy role rather than a communications role. But the communications special advisors will again be doing the political work which civil servants are not necessarily comfortable doing. So they can give a line to the media which is more political. They can highlight political dimensions behind stories or presentational issues the government is facing in a way that the civil service, again, would not feel comfortable doing. And then the third role is about political liaison. So it's about building links with key constituencies and stakeholders. Obviously, for most ministers, that includes members of parliament because they need to have a good relationship with MPs, particularly if they need to get legislation through parliament itself, as well as with the wider party. In the case of Labour, that will include, of course, the trade unions. In the case of the Conservative Party, that will also include a very close relationship with the business community and the private sector. So these three roles are ones that most SPADs will be fulfilling, and most special advisors will be concentrating on one of these, although there are special advisors who will do at least two of these roles simultaneously, and in one or two cases will actually do all three, but that's relatively unusual. Just a couple of other quick points to make, Dean. One is that another critical role of a departmental special advisor is to be a contact point between their boss and number 11 and number 10 Downing Street. Obviously, for most ministers, they will want their special advisors to be working closely with number 10 so that they keep inside on what the Prime Minister's priorities are and what he wants them to do in their department. So managing that relationship with number 10 is very important. And then also for many departments, managing the relationship with the Treasury is also critical. We've just had a spending review last month, which has allocated public money to each of the key government departments. And special advisors will often play a role liaising with special advisors in the Treasury to make sure that their department can get the best possible outcome from a spending review. The other thing I was just going to say quickly is that for those on the call who want to get more of an insight into what the special advisor is actually doing in their daily work, one way of doing this, of course, is to watch some of the really interesting and in some ways amusing TV productions that have been made about the life of British government. And one of the ones which I would recommend is called The Thick of It. It's available at the moment on BBC iPlayer for those who are interested. And those programmes look at the role of ministers, civil servants, and also special advisors. And as I say, they provide a lot of quite amusing insight into what it is special advisors are actually doing, the contribution that they make, but also sometimes the mistakes and mishaps that do occur in Whitehall departments. So for anyone who's particularly interested in looking at what special advisors do, I would really recommend those programs.
Yeah, and I think go back to programs like Yes Minister as well. It shows that these sort of responsibilities have been in the mix for a little while already, and it's nothing. It's not a new phenomenon, but it shows actually how it's progressed over time, and the thick of it takes it one step further. I guess the next question I have is because of all these responsibilities that are going on. I do know that we obviously know some SPADs have actually become the story themselves. What does happen when that happens?
Well, that's absolutely true. And most special advisors would cultivate a behind the scenes approach. So they would not be advisors who would be trying to have a high public profile. Clearly, their job is to support their minister and to give their minister the political backing that the Secretary of State needs to be effective in their job. So for most special advisors, there's a premium on keeping in the background. However, as probably many people on the call know, that doesn't always happen. And there are some special advisors who've become much more widely known. They've developed a public image, sometimes a notorious and controversial image. And I've just put here on the slide a few examples from recent history of special advisors who've become better known in the public domain. The first is obviously Alistair Campbell. I worked with Alistair when he was the Director of Communications in number 10 Downing Street. Alistair was probably the first really high-profile political spin doctor, so-called, to operate in British government. And I think for that reason, he developed obviously a very high public profile. I think other issues obviously contributed to that, particularly the controversies around the war in Iraq and Alistair Campbell giving evidence to the official inquiry meant that he was always going to have that higher profile. But I think as one of the first kind of modern spin doctors in British government, Alistair Campbell is somebody that we would know well as a former special advisor and somebody who in his time in government did have a much higher public profile than most special advisors. Then moving on, Steve Hilton, who was a key policy aide working with David Cameron after 2010. Steve Hilton probably less well known than Alistair Campbell, although now running to be governor in California in the United States, so an interesting career shift. But Steve Hilton was somebody who brought a lot of unconventional thinking into the first period of the Cameron government. He was one of the advisors particularly responsible for developing the notion of the big society and some of the other thinking about how to update and modernise how the public sector and government works. Then Nick Timothy and Fiona Hill, and I've put them here because they were particularly significant in that they were regarded as extremely influential and very powerful in their period as special advisors working for Theresa May in Downing Street. They were not there for a very long period of time, but in the period they were in number 10 with Theresa May, they were considered to be, as I say, really important in shaping the Prime Minister's thinking. They often dealt directly with other ministers. They certainly became quite notorious because of their brusque, and sometimes quite conflictual approach to managing relationships with others. But for that reason, they also became very well known. They were regarded as responsible for the Conservative general election result in 2017, which was unexpectedly a poor result. And so they moved on very shortly after that general election. And then finally, Dominic Cummings. Obviously, we know Dominic Cummings well from the COVID period. He was Boris Johnson's chief policy strategist and number 10. Again, exercised a lot of influence in that period, became controversial because of some of the decisions that were taken around the management of the pandemic, and of course, his own involvement in potential breaches of the COVID rules. So, Dean, you've got there just, I think, 4 examples or 5 examples of special advisors who became very well known for different reasons in the public domain. I think it's also worth saying that special advisors have gone on to hold extremely influential positions in government. So both David Cameron and Ed Miliband, the Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition after 2010, were former special advisors. And there are former special advisors working in this government now. So, for example, Peter Kyle, the Secretary of State at the Department for Science and Technology, is a former special advisor. Liz Kendall at the Department of Work and Pensions, also a former SPAD. So special advisors have gone on to hold even more influential and senior positions in politics once they have moved on from those special advisor roles.
Thank you, Patrick. I just wanted to remind everyone as well that I know that there have been some questions have been coming in, but please do pop a question if you have one in the Q&A box, and we'll be able to come to those in the last part of today's session. On this, though, quickly, Patrick, I know you mentioned earlier about the Prime Minister having the ultimate sign-off, and I remember I think it was Dominic Cummings blocking a Treasury appointment in as a special advisor. Is that something that, I know you said it's not too common, but is it something that does cause problems for governments based on who they want to put into these positions?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, it can lead to conflict, particularly between number 10 and the respective Secretary of State. It's interesting you mentioned there, Dean, Dominic Cummings, because Dominic Cummings was himself blocked as a special advisor appointment in 2010 by David Cameron, although he was eventually allowed to become a special advisor to Michael Gove in the Department for Education. There were several attempts by number 10 to try to move him on because they felt that for different reasons they weren't comfortable with his role working alongside Michael Gove. And then, as you say, in the period after Dominic Cummings entered number 10, working for Boris Johnson, there were several instances where special advisors were removed from their roles. I think the case you mentioned was the special advisor to the then Chancellor, who was dismissed from their role by Dominic Cummings for allegedly leaking information to the press. That special advisor did actually successfully take the government to a tribunal, so they were awarded for wrongful dismissal. But it's certainly just one example of where, yes, special advisor appointments can become big news, and they can become controversial and potentially unhelpful to the image of the government in a way that ministers would be trying to avoid.
Of course. And so you do mention about some of them being more well known than others. Why do you think it is that SPADs have built this sort of reputation for being both powerful and hidden? Is it secrecy by design, or is it actually just how the system's evolved?
So I think it is in some ways how the system works. In our system of government, as people on the call will know, accountability means that the accountability relationship goes through the Secretary of State, goes through the minister. So they're responsible for all of the decisions taken in their department rather than the special advisor. Special advisors don't appear in Parliament. They don't, by and large, give evidence to committees. They're not held accountable in that way. So that, I think, contributes to their relatively low profile. It's also the case that many special advisors want to be anonymous. You know, for them, being effective is about building relationships. It's about working closely with the civil service. It's about developing relationships with other special advisors across government. And if you've got a very high public profile, if people worry that you're going to be briefing the media about things that they say, then obviously it's going to make your job more difficult. So I think to answer your question, most special advisors would consider it to be in their interests not to develop a very high public profile. And it should be said that in every single case on this slide, the high public profile of the special advisor led to them leaving government fairly soon afterwards, because I think it does make your position increasingly unsustainable.
Yeah, I think in terms of the notion that the people that live in the dark, do you want to take us through this maybe that will help us maybe put some light on the scenario, as it were?
Yeah, so I think what I want to get across is that special advisors are really important players in government. And in a moment, I'm just going to share some thoughts about how we can best engage with them. But it's also important to bear in mind that special advisors have attracted controversy. And as I mentioned before, I referred to some particular examples of this. Why are special advisors criticised? Well, there is a view that they're not held accountable properly for the things that they do in government because they don't appear before Parliament or before select committees or other forums. They can take decisions or do things for which they're not properly held accountable. I think there have also been criticisms from within the civil service. Some civil servants have felt uncomfortable with special advisors. There's a belief that special advisors bring too much politics into the policy making and communications process in ways that civil servants feel could not corrupt, but certainly undermine due process and the effectiveness of policy making. And as I mentioned, there have also been some certain scandals, crises, and also cases of impropriety in which special advisors have been involved. For example, creating channels in which corporate interests have had access to government in a way which is deemed to be inappropriate, and the special advisor has played a role in doing that. There have also obviously been scandals in the press. I mentioned the case of Dominic Cummings during the COVID lockdown. So examples like that just highlight that there's certainly no question that special advisors can attract controversy, even though, as I said, I think the vast majority much prefer a rather more anonymous and quiet existence than having this kind of profile in the media.
That also actually probably comes to a question that we've had come in on the Q&A. I know they say that they may not be formally recruited, but is there any transparency around who they all are? Is there a list of them anywhere, or is it something that you've got to try and find out yourself?
No, there is greater transparency now. So the government publishes twice a year a list of all special advisors appointed across government. You can access that on the HMG website. And it also includes information about their salaries. It doesn't give you their precise salary, but it tells you what band the special advisor is in terms of the pay that they receive. And it will tell you the special advisors both across number 10, the Treasury, and all of the government departments. So there is some transparency about who the special advisors are, even if the recruitment process itself is, as I said, rather informal and really driven by the personal kind of views and needs of the individual Secretary of State.
Right. And I guess if they're not always taking us onto the next section, I suppose. So if they're not always visible and they can seem quite closed off, what would you say is the best way for organizations or individuals to actually start engaging with them?
Yeah, so this is an issue that I've talked to a lot of stakeholders, organizations about over the years, because for understandable reasons, anybody who's working in the space of public policy, whether that's in the private or public sector, may at different times feel that they need to have some connection or link into what ministers are doing. And clearly special advisors are an extremely important channel into ministerial decision making because they work very closely with the minister. They know their minister's mind. They know what their minister's interested in. They know what their minister's priorities are. I should say, though, just at this point, that it's important to emphasize that although special advisors are often very powerful, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily the best placed person to handle the issue or problem that you are facing. And there are many situations in which I've advised organizations to approach civil servants rather than necessarily special advisors, because there may be instances where the civil servant is actually going to be better placed to resolve that issue. So I want to make it clear to everybody that my advice is don't assume that the special advisor is necessarily going to have the solution or answer to the problem that you are trying to deal with. Having said that, of course, special advisors, for the reasons I've mentioned, are very powerful, very influential. So there are often good grounds for engaging with special advisors and putting resource and time into doing that. I think there's a couple of things that people need to be aware of, though, in undertaking that process. I mean, one is obvious, which is that special advisors are, of course, incredibly busy. Their schedules are packed throughout the day. They have extremely busy diaries, many different priorities to juggle. They're trying to get on with their own work as well as chasing the work of the minister. They're preparing speeches, briefings, policy documents, handling the media. It's an extremely busy, difficult role that involves a lot of multitasking. So for that reason, getting direct access to a special advisor can obviously be very challenging. In particular, getting meetings can be tough. I would say that, though, if you need to open up a channel of communication with a special advisor, and you're going to do that most often in written form, so you're going to write them a letter or a submission or hand on a briefing document. The really important thing is to make that written communication as direct and concise as you possibly can. So you need to be very, very clear why you feel that that special advisor needs to get involved in the issue or problem that you have. What is that issue? Why is it important? And also critically, what is it that you're asking for? You don't, for a busy SPAD, just want to give them a problem. You also want to give them a potential solution and a way through that is both good for you, but also helps the government and the minister of the day. And I would say that, trying to engage with special advisors can be difficult for reasons I've mentioned. Getting contact into SPADs can be hard, and getting them to focus on your issue can be difficult. But it's absolutely worth persevering with this because, for all the reasons I've mentioned, special advisors are a fantastic conduit, channel, point of contact with the government of the day. They are their master's voice. They do understand how their minister thinks. And so working with special advisors can often be a really effective way of organisations increasing their impact. As I mentioned, though, and this is where I'll end, what's I think really important to understand is it's not an either-or issue. You need to work with special advisors, but also build up your contacts with civil servants and with other professionals who are working in government. Don't just focus on the SPADs. Make sure you've got contacts across the board. But as I say, I think special advisors do, play a really important role for organisations in undertaking direct engagement with government.
Thanks, Patrick. And on the point around the civil service and also building contacts there, we have had a question about the interplay between the civil servants and SPADs. So they've asked what roles within the civil service are most likely to face challenges when working with special advisors, and why would that be?
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question, and there are different types of challenge. I think one of the areas where there has historically been perhaps more issues is around the communications area. When you've got civil service press officers who are obviously briefing the press and giving information to the media about what the government's doing and what its policies are. But you've also got political special advisors potentially working as communications aides who are themselves also briefing the media. And I mean, there can be instances where there is confusion, where the civil service feels that the special advisor has maybe gone too far on a particular briefing. They may feel that the special advisor is leading to confusion. So I think that has been an area where there have been problems in the past. I think also in the policy domain, there are some civil servants who feel that special advisors can be a blockage in getting advice to ministers. So certainly historically, there have been some special advisors who've been incredibly powerful in their department. Just to give you one very quick example, Ed Balls, who was economic advisor to Gordon Brown between 1997 and 2003, would be a case of somebody who within the Treasury was exercising incredible power and influence. And I think at the time there were some Treasury officials who felt that Ed Balls was operating as a blockage in the sense that if they wanted Gordon Brown, the Chancellor at the time, to see advice, it would have to go through Ed Balls first. And that this meant it was more difficult to get the advice into him that they wanted to make available. Of course, on the other side, Ed Balls and his supporters would argue that he was making government work more efficiently because by working with civil servants, he made sure that the advice that went up to the Chancellor was advice that he would benefit from and that answered the questions that he was concerned with and gave him the very best handle that was possible on the given policy issue, whether it was a tax decision or a spending decision or whatever that was. So I think there are different ways of seeing it, but it's certainly the case that in the past, civil servants have felt frustration that maybe special advisors are kind of acting as a block or a barrier in terms of their access to ministers.
Brings on to another question from the Q&A. Who would you say ultimately holds more power? Would it be the SPADs or senior officials, or is there a certain way that maybe you need to navigate engaging between the two sets?
So again, that's a very good question, and it highlights a point that I should have emphasised earlier, which is that because special advisors are classified as temporary civil servants, they don't carry out all of the roles that obviously a permanent civil servant would. And I think one very important example of that would be decisions around the use of public expenditure. Special advisors do not have the power to sign off budgets or to allocate money to different activities within government departments. It's also the case that special advisors are not able, they don't have the power in most instances to actually line manage civil servants or other teams who are working in the public sector. So in that sense, special advisors' powers in a formal sense are rather limited. Civil servants obviously have the power to allocate public money, and clearly most teams in departments are led by civil servants. So senior civil servants do in many cases have very significant influence and leverage. What makes the special advisor particularly powerful is the fact that they are able to shape and influence their ministers' thinking. So I think there are particular decisions where special advisors can become very important, but in terms of the day-to-day running of government, I would say senior civil servants still hold a significant amount of influence and power.
Excellent. Thank you, Patrick. I think we are probably heading into the Q&A section for reals now. So in terms of the first question that I've got here is from Rosie. Can you tell us about the relationship between the departmental and number 10 and number 11 SPADs? What's the process of negotiating on policy, budgets, and the content of legislation?
Yeah, again, so that's another really insightful question. Of course, it depends a lot on the way that the government of the day is operating. And what I mean by that is that there are some prime ministers and some governments who will operate in a very centralised way. They want all power to flow through number 10 Downing Street. They want to be really in control of what's happening. And that was certainly the case, for example, with Tony Blair. He was thought to be a prime minister who was actually at some instances called a presidential leader rather than a prime ministerial leader because he wanted, it was thought to be really in control of everything that was happening. And it's certainly true that Tony Blair built up a very big operation in number 10 Downing Street, which meant that for departmental special advisors, in order for policy decisions to be taken, they would actually have to spend a considerable amount of time negotiating with Tony Blair special advisors in the policy unit. And it was also the case that often departments were having to respond to policy initiatives which were being driven by number 10. So, for example, in the period I was working in government, some people may have heard of an individual called Andrew Adonis, who's been very influential in education reform. He was working as a special advisor in number 10 for Tony Blair. And he was actually injecting a lot of ideas and policy thinking into the Department for Education, which special advisors in the department were then having to manage and process and negotiate over. So I think that's just an example of where a very powerful prime minister who wants to centralise government makes it the case that special advisors from the department and number 10 will spend a lot of time working with and negotiating with one another. Of course, though, there have been other governments where prime ministers have wanted to be more, you could say, hands-off, less interested in trying to control the day-to-day work of departments. I think that was true for the first few years of David Cameron's premiership, partly because of the fact it was a coalition government between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. In that period, number 10 was less powerful, less important in trying to negotiate with departments. And so for that reason, in that period, special advisors in the departments would probably have spent less time negotiating with the policy unit in number 10, partly because the policy unit was much smaller and there were fewer advisors there who could really negotiate with the departmental level special advisors and ministers. Just to say another word on this quickly, Dean, in terms of the Treasury, I think obviously negotiating between departmental SPADs and special advisors in the Treasury is always important because for many departments, the Treasury plays a crucial role, obviously, in setting budgets and determining public spending allocations. Clearly, there are particular periods of the year when that becomes very important. So I think the two most important would be the run up to a budget, which normally takes place in the autumn. There's also, of course, a PBR in the spring of each year, usually a pre-budget report in which there may also be spending decisions that the government takes, more of a short-term nature, which may involve negotiations between departmental SPADs and number 11 SPADs. And then, of course, every 3 years, there's also a spending review process, as I mentioned earlier, which takes place. And again, for departmental SPADs, during a spending review process, they will spend a lot of time working with the special advisors in the Treasury. And really what the special advisors are bringing is a political dimension to that process. So if you cut this budget, will that have a politically negative effect in terms of the government standing and profile? They will also, of course, bring a perspective from their minister. You know, if you cut this program, that's going to be very damaging to my reputation as a Secretary of State. So what the special advisors are able to do is more informally act as a channel between their ministers in providing information, political insight, intelligence, really with a view to making the workings of government more effective. And to go back to the question that was asked a few minutes ago about civil servants, I think it is the case that the majority of civil servants tend to value having special advisors around because special advisors can have the conversations which they as civil servants would not be comfortable having. So I think, you know, for those who support special advisors in government, which isn't everybody, but for those who think they do add value, I think part of that value is about being able to act as a network across government that should hopefully help government to work more smoothly. I mean, for all the reasons we've mentioned in terms of the controversies, that doesn't always happen, but I think in most cases, you know, SPADs do help to oil the wheels of government and make the system work better and more efficiently than it would otherwise do.
Thank you. We've also had a question, I guess, about the general role of a special advisor, and it's about their loyalties. Is it to the minister, is it to the government of the day, or is it to the party first and foremost?
Well, again, I think there's probably some ambiguity about that. But I would say that for the vast majority of special advisors, their loyalty has to be to their individual Secretary of State. I think particularly where the special advisor is appointed by that individual minister, the loyalty and the fundamental trust has to be between the special advisor and the minister. And if that trust doesn't exist, if the minister is unsure about the special advisor, doesn't really trust what they're doing, then that can be very damaging also to the special advisor themselves, because if civil servants know that a special advisor isn't influential, then their power very, very quickly diminishes. So I think the fundamental bond of trust between the minister and the special advisor is really what shapes the loyalty within government. But there have been attempts over the years to try to make special advisors more loyal to the centre in number 10 Downing Street. So we mentioned earlier the case of Dominic Cummings and the firing of a Treasury special advisor. That was a period in which number 10 was really trying to assert more control, more direction over special advisors across government on the basis that, as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, all special advisors technically serve at the pleasure of the Prime Minister. And so for Dominic Cummings, he wanted to make special advisors much more accountable, much more, believing that they have to deliver for the Prime Minister rather than just their individual minister. And, every government will be trying to get special advisors to work in a more corporate, collaborative way. Obviously, you want SPADs to feel that they're delivering not just for the government, not just for the individual minister, but for the government as a whole. But as I say, clearly, for the reasons I've mentioned, a lot of special advisors will ultimately be focusing on how do I boost the reputation of my boss? How do I make sure that my minister looks as positive and favourable as possible in the eyes of the media and the public? Because ultimately, if their minister is removed from their post, it's the special advisor who also loses their job. So I think the incentives very much flow in the direction of special advisors focusing on their loyalty to their individual minister.
Thanks. I think we've got a question really about the interplay within the department. So, one question is around whether it's just secretaries of state, or do more junior ministers have special advisors as well? And then we've also got a question about what's the interplay between the Secretary of State's special advisors and then the ministers and parliamentary under secretaries of state, for example, within a department.
Yeah, so it's normally the case in a department that a minister of state wouldn't be able to appoint special advisors, but there are exceptions to that. So there are ministers of state who do perform particularly expansive, challenging roles. For example, the Minister of Housing, which is now a Secretary of State cabinet level position, but in the past has been appoints a Minister of State position, that minister would, in some circumstances, be given a special advisor because the role is so challenging. Similarly, when I was working in government, it was often the case that the Minister for Europe, who was not at the cabinet level because they sat below and reported to the Foreign Secretary, that they would often also have a special advisor because obviously being Minister for Europe at that point, when we were still in the EU, was an extremely challenging role. So I think that there are cases where ministers of state have special advisors, but it's the exception rather than the rule. And to come to the second question, what would normally happen is that the special advisors in the department would support chiefly the work of the Secretary of State, but they would also be working with the relevant junior ministers, particularly where the junior minister was working on something that was very strategically important for the department. For example, getting legislation through the House of Commons or working on a very controversial policy reform. In those cases, the SPADs would be working closely with the junior minister as well as with the Secretary of State. And also, SPADs will definitely have contact with, for example, parliamentary private secretaries, the MPs who are working on behalf of secretaries of state, being a channel into the parliamentary party. I think particularly where there are issues of legislation, trying to get legislation through Parliament, and making sure you've got the numbers in place to do that. The special advisors will definitely be working closely with the PPS to make sure that the work is being done to ensure that there is a parliamentary majority in place. I mean, we've seen obviously in the last couple of months for this government the challenge of trying to get welfare reform legislation through Parliament, and the fact that that became very difficult for the government because in the end it didn't have the numbers for its proposals. And that just highlights the importance really of special advisors playing their part in making sure that the political liaison work is being done, so that where reforms are being pushed from within a department, the Secretary of State can be confident that they're going to get the parliamentary backing to get those measures through Parliament and get them implemented.
Thank you. And I will come back to maybe more of this current government. But first of all, we've got a few questions about maybe how the role has changed over time. So one question is around your specific time. Did you notice any changes in the dynamic between SPADs, ministers, and the civil service between your first and second periods as a special advisor? And then maybe looking more into the future, do you think with more powers being devolved, whether it be to devolved parliaments or to mayors and local authorities, whether the role of a SPAD might change again in the future?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's absolutely fascinating questions, and very challenging. I think on the first question about what changes I observed, I would say that in my period in government, there was definitely more formalisation in the role of SPADs. So there have been some controversies involving different special advisors. And actually, when I was working in government the second time, the government introduced a specific code for special advisors, a code of standards that they were required to meet in order to be able to retain their job in government. So there was, I think, much more emphasis on making sure that there were explicit standards that SPADs were required to follow. I think that reflected some of the controversies that had occurred in the previous period. And I think also in terms of the informal way that government worked, I think there was a feeling during the New Labour years that maybe special advisors in certain departments had become too powerful. And actually, when Gordon Brown became Prime Minister in 2007, he wanted consciously, I think, to make the way government worked a bit more formal, make sure that the civil service was protected from some of the perceived politicisation that had been going on. And so I think by the time I went back into government a second time, I would say SPADs were much more sensitive to making sure that they stuck within the established parameters of their role, that they didn't offend the civil service. I think they were more careful, maybe more cautious about how they went about their jobs. Some people would say that that made SPADs less effective. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that, but certainly there was a feeling that maybe SPADs had had their wings clipped to some extent, and that obviously affected how they worked. I think to come to the second question, which is also a really important, great question. I think the devolution of power does obviously affect how SPADs work. And actually, something I didn't mention earlier on is that in the time I was in government, when devolution was being rolled out in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, the relationship between special advisors in the devolved governments and in Whitehall also became more important. So SPADs weren't just negotiating with number 10 and number 11 from departments, they were also negotiating potentially with special advisors who were working for the Welsh and Scottish governments, both at the Whitehall level, but also at the devolved executive level. And I think you can see that with devolution rolling out now across England, you've got combined authorities, obviously with potentially powerful directly elected mayors. This is also going to require special advisors and civil servants to work more closely with those devolved administrations. And I think for special advisors in particular, they will need to have political relationships with the staff who are working on behalf of directly elected mayors. Directly elected mayors so far don't have special advisors in the way that we have in Whitehall, because obviously devolved combined authorities are not the same as central government in Whitehall. But there are certainly individuals who work for most mayors who play that kind of political advisor role. And I think that as directly elected mayors get more involved in the workings of government, negotiating big projects, infrastructure investment, economic development, trade, and so on, we're likely to see SPADs in Whitehall devoting more time to managing those relationships with combined authority directly elected mayors. And of course, what that emphasizes is that, the job of the SPAD is going to become even more challenging, because not only do they have to manage relationships within their department as well as across government, they're also going to have to manage relationships with these new institutions at the devolved government level. And as I say, that's going to make their job, no doubt, even more time consuming and also even more challenging.
Thank you, Patrick. And I did threaten we would come to the new government. So obviously, at the big news probably about a year ago to this day was the appointment of Sue Gray, and then the removal of Sue Gray and Morgan McSweeney moving in a bit more. And I guess the question I had, and a few people have had in the comments as well, is around what your thoughts are on the current government and their use of special advisors, as it's a year in, I suppose. What picture we've got of the current group of SPADs?
So, well, I think there's a couple of reflections which are important, even if they're still quite obvious. I mean, one is that special advisors retain a really important role in the way that British government works. I mean, I think there's always a possibility that when a new government comes in, it decides that special advisors aren't going to be very important. And as I said earlier on, I think to some degree, the Cameron government, which came in 2010, initially wanted to downgrade special advisors and felt that their role was maybe not as important as previous governments had done. I think with the Starmer government coming in, there's no appetite to move away from a model in which SPADs are playing a very important role in what the government is doing. I mean, my observations on that would be that I think the SPADs display both the strengths and weaknesses of the system, in the sense that the special advisors who are working in the Starmer government are generally younger, very enthusiastic, and they have often a very strong relationship with their Secretary of State because they worked with them in opposition. And I think that there's real value in that, which is that they have a good relationship of trust. They really understand where their minister's coming from, they understand what the priorities are, and so on. I think the difficulty on the other side, which obviously confronts all new governments, is that most of those special advisors are relatively inexperienced in working within the institutions of government. Labour's been out of power for nearly 15 years, so the staff who were working for most ministers, with one or two exceptions, won't have had much experience of working in government before. And so clearly getting the machinery of government to work well can be more difficult if you don't necessarily understand how the system works. Now, you mentioned, Dean, Sue Gray. Sue Gray, in a sense, was the solution to that problem because obviously Sue Gray, as you know, and as many callers will know, has a lot of experience working in British government actually as a civil servant rather than a special advisor. And I think the idea was that Sue Gray would come in and she would provide that experience, that know-how, that understanding of how the system of government works, which perhaps the less experienced special advisors wouldn't have. For different reasons, there's been a lot of speculation in the media that hasn't quite worked out. And Keir Starmer has brought Morgan McSweeney into that role as someone who brings a much more political, strategic perspective to what the government is doing. And I guess time will tell how successful and effective that is going to be. Obviously, Morgan McSweeney is driving a very strong political narrative about the government maintaining a strong profile on issues like immigration and housing and so on. But as I say, I think ultimately every government is judged by delivery. What change is it making? Is it improving living standards? Is it making public services better? Is it improving the performance of the NHS? Is it building more houses? And that will be what determines how the government is judged in 3 or 4 years' time. And that relies on making the machinery of government work really smoothly, which isn't really just about special advisors. It's about making sure that ministers, crucially civil servants, special advisors, but also the people working on the front line of public services are as aligned as closely as possible. And I think sometimes we get a bit distracted with these debates around Whitehall. I mean, certainly I'm guilty of that. We focus on what's going on in central government, but it's going to be out there on the front line of day-to-day delivery. That will be what really shapes, I think, how this government is seen at the next election.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you everyone. I suppose for joining us this morning. I probably do have just one. If you want a 60-second answer for this one, Patrick, I think you briefly mentioned it there. A lot of people have asked around sort of the difference between, I guess, the machinery of government, the knowledge of that for a special advisor, or actually maybe what should it be more on their sectoral knowledge? Where do you think the balance can be drawn between the two?
I think it really depends on the role. Again, it's a very insightful question. I think there are certain departments where sectoral knowledge is very, very important. I mean, in the time I was in government, there was a particular special advisor who worked in the Department for Work and Pensions, who was reappointed by every new Secretary of State who came in because he had an incredible knowledge of how the social security system worked. He knew the mechanics of pensions, of the benefit system, and so on. So I think in certain departments, you probably do want that sectoral knowledge. I think, though, in most cases, what you're drawing on from the special advisor is really their knowledge of how government works, how to position what the department is doing within the overall political story that the government is trying to tell, and obviously making sure that the work of the minister is presented in the best light possible. So I think the emphasis tends to be more on generalism than specialism, but there are a few exceptions to that. I'm an academic, Dean, so I can't answer things in 60 seconds, but that's my best thought of that question.
It's really appreciated, Patrick. So I just want to quickly say that I know that we probably haven't got through every question that's come through. Hopefully, I'm seeing some of them. Hopefully, if we will be sending out a recording of this session. So I do think we've actually answered it throughout either the presentation or through the Q&A section. So maybe flick back through and watch it in case you've missed it. As I said, this is the first of a series of Insight webinars. And if you do have any ideas of what you'd like to see in the future, please drop us a message and let us know, and then we'll try and cover them in the future. We will be sending out a recording. And I know that another question that's come through a lot is around the contact details of special advisors. And I'd always say then, if there's anyone in particular you'd like to get in touch with, as always, reach out to Dods and we'll see if we can help answer that for you. Again, thank you for joining today. I don't know, Patrick, if you wanted to say a quick goodbye as well.
Well, no, I just want to thank everyone for the really insightful questions, which have made me think even more about the role of SPADs, particularly I think how that's going to change given all the issues around devolution and the changing shape of government. But yeah, really great questions. I really appreciate it and hope to meet many of you in the future if you've got an interest in central government and government effectiveness. It's always great to have the opportunity to meet like this and to exchange thoughts and ideas. So thanks to everybody for coming today. I really appreciate it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Patrick. And as you'll see on the screen, there is a 10% offer for anyone who is either a current client of Dods or a future client of Dods. For a Dods Research product, please get in touch with us, either an account manager or our customer service team. Thank you all and enjoy the rest of your day.